Hello! Welcome to a video about what semantic synchrony does. In this video I'll focus on nonlinearity, which is a new thing for computers to be able to do. In order to describe what it does, first I have to explain a little bit about what it is. Semantic synchrony has two parts, a front end or client and a back end or server. The back end is where the graph exists. The back end keeps the graph. And the graph looks something like this. The graph is a bunch of things called notes. Each one of these dots, the red and blue and yellow dots, are notes, which are some text. Each one of them is some text. Like one could be your grocery list, one could be a list of people you know, one could be things you want to do today, one could be your thoughts on Afghanistan. There are notes and there are edges, which are arrows connecting the notes. Every one of these green things goes from one note to another. So that's a scheme of what the graph looks like. That's in the back end. You never interact with the back end directly, though. You only interact with it through the front end. And the front end looks like this. Also looks like this. The front end is a text editor. These are words that you can edit. So I'm going to add some words. So yeah, it's some words that you can edit. And those words represent the graph that's in the back end. Okay, so nonlinearity lets you represent overlapping categories. Here I've got a category, some stories. And it has two subcategories. Stories about my mom, Ellen Brown. Stories about my dad, Cliff Brown. Shout out. They are wonderful. We got three stories that fit into those two categories. Helping Jimmy Keller is something my mom did and my dad didn't really have anything to do with it. And sneaking into the library over Christmas is something my dad did and my mom didn't have anything to do with it. But when the suitcase fell into the ocean, they were both part of that story. So that story should belong to both categories, stories about my mom and stories about my dad. Okay, so that's a graph. That's conceptually the data that we're going to represent. Now let's see what it looks like in semantic synchrony. Okay, so here I've visited it. You see at the bottom some stories. That's the label of this window. So what we're looking at right now are the children of some stories. Some stories is a note. Stories about my mom is also a note, and stories about my dad is also a note. So these two notes on the screen are children of the note called some stories, which is not on the screen. We can expand the tree a little bit, and we see stories about my mom has two stories in it. Those two stories. Similarly, stories about my dad has two stories in it. On the right-hand side, this first column of numbers indicates how many parents each thing has. So, sneaking into the library over Christmas break, that has one parent, and we can see its parent. Its parent is stories about my dad. Most things on this screen have only one parent, but one of them has two parents. When the suitcase fell into the ocean has two parents, and since both of its parents are on the screen, stories about my mom is one of the parents, and stories about my dad is the other parent. Since both of those parents are on the screen, when the suitcase fell into the ocean appears twice. If I visit when the suitcase fell into the ocean, notice that there are no children under when the suitcase fell into the ocean. Stories about my mom has two children, and one of those is Helping Jimmy Keller, which has one parent and no children. The other child of stories about my mom is When the Suitcase Fell into the Ocean, which has two parents and no children. So now I'm going to visit When the Suitcase Fell into the Ocean. Now you see at the bottom of the screen it says When the Suitcase Fell. So that's what we're looking at right now. We don't see anything because it has no children, and we are looking at the forward view. There's two kinds of views that you can look at from any note. You can look forward at its children or backward at its parents. Let's look backwards. So if we look backwards at a depth of 1, we see stories about my dad and stories about my mom. Those are the two parents of When the Suitcase Fell. We can expand that tree a little bit, and we see that the grandfather of When the Suitcase Fell is some stories, or grandmother. And we can expand that ancestry a lot. Right? 3, 4, 5, 6. You can expand ancestries or descendancies up to 7 layers. More than that would kind of make your computer choke, so we don't do that. Alright, I think that might be all I was showing you. That's nonlinearity. So if you want to get really weird, semantic synchrony is so nonlinear that something can be a child of it or a grandchild of itself. I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to copy stories about my mom, and I'm going to put When the Suitcase Fell into the Ocean. I'm going to visit that, and I'm going to put stories about my mom. So now if I expand this, we see Stories About My Mom has a child called When Suitcase Fell into the Ocean, which has a child called Stories About My Mom, which has a story called When the Suitcase Fell into the Ocean. So that's nonlinearity for you. I guess I'm done. So I hope you enjoyed this video. There will be more like it. So maybe I'll see you again soon. Later.